Welcome back everybody to our journey into Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, part 2 for Tuesday's sneak peeks into the set, where we are picking up at green. So let's jump back into it. We're going to start with the only green card that has been released in today's sneak peeks, which is Historian's Wisdom, which is a 3-mana enchantment aura. You can enchant either an artifact or a creature, where when this enters the battlefield, if the enchanted permanent is a creature with the greatest power among creatures on the battlefield, you draw a card. And as long as the enchanted permanent is a creature, it gets +2/+1. So keep in mind that when this is immediately attached to a creature, it doesn't get to increase the power of that creature and then do the first effect. What happens first is that the creature that you're attaching this to needs to already be the most powerful of all creatures on the board, because that's what's allowing you to draw your card. The +2/+1 is an added benefit after the fact. 3 mana draw a card and give target creature +2/+1 is slow. This does modify the card, so it counts as a modification. Green already runs a lot of enchantments, but for this to allow you to draw a card, you need to put this in your mind as a 3 mana draw 1 card, give target creature +2/+1 permanently, which is a modification. You have to combo this with other cards that allow you to benefit more off of modified creatures, which I can already think of one that is my favorite that I would combo this with, a certain tree, a certain Groot. So this would be really good in that. I think that because it allows you to draw a card, that makes this more valuable, because it replaces itself. It doesn't slow down the green deck. Green already runs. If you're not running an elf deck, green runs fairly slow because you're looking at pulling maybe lands out of your deck, but you're not really drawing a whole lot of cards. Elves run really quickly because you're skimming through the top cards of your library, pulling out elves into your hand, then the elves that you play allow you to get land from your library, so those run really quickly already. But I think that if you're running a modification deck, it may not run quite as quickly unless you're comboing with elves, but so far our modified combos are coming from spirits, so this card needs to draw you a card to be good, meaning that you're attaching it to a creature that already is the board control, the threat on the board, because it has to be the most powerful card that is on the board for both between you and your opponent. So that makes this a little bit less appealing, but again, it modifies the card, allows you to draw a card. I think you run it in those decks, even though at face value, if I were just evaluating this card without the modified combos, I'd say this is too slow of a card, even though it lets you draw a card. But specifically in a green deck, this is where this card needs to be. I'm definitely going to try to run it in my modified spirit deck. Maybe it does still end up being too slow, but it's certainly worth a shot. I think it's going to be good. I'm going to give it a try. So that's all the green cards, the only green cards that they sneak peeked for today. So let's move on. We move into the multicolored section. And we start with Iganjo Uprising is how I'm going to pronounce this card. I'm going to stick to it. It is a red, white, and then X mana cost card. Sorcery that allows you to create X 2/2 white samurai creature tokens, each with vigilance, and they also gain menace and haste until the end of the turn. But each opponent creates X -1 2/2 white samurai creature tokens, also with vigilance. Okay, so that's not terrible. You're still going to have board control. I don't like the idea that the mana that I'm tapping is still benefiting my opponent in any way. So for 2 mana, that's just the cost of the card. X is however much other mana you want to tap with this. So I picture like you probably at least want to tap 4 mana for this card, for yourself at least, if you're just evaluating how much you want it on the board. But if I'm getting 4 2/2 white samurai creature tokens with vigilance, menace, and haste until the end of turn, and my opponent is getting 3, because that's 4 -1, they're getting 3 2/2 white samurai creature tokens with vigilance on their side of the board. I understand that the menace is meant to force them to use their tokens immediately to block, and so that means they take out 1 of each of your samurai for each Yeah, I think this card ends up being too slow. I understand that the menace is meant to make it to where your samurai are just going to be even better for that turn, and you're hoping that your opponent uses their samurai to block, because they don't really need samurai. But I don't think that the goal of any card should be, I'm going to flood my board, and you can kind of flood yours. So I think that this card is too slow, and I think that it benefits your opponent far too much, even if your turn that you've played this card is going to be way better than what they can do with your samurai that you've just given them. So that's my take. Too slow. So now we move to one of the cards that I think has, that one of the coolest art. I like tech stuff. We look at Prodigys Prototype, which is a 3-mana card. One is white, one is blue, one can be any color. It's a 3/4 vehicle where whenever one or more vehicles that you control attack, you create a 1/1 colorless pilot creature token with the ability that it can crew a vehicle as though its power were 2 or greater, and this vehicle requires a 2 crew. I think this is a really good card. It combos really well with other vehicles and allows you to keep board control, keep the ability to pilot your vehicles. If you have enough to pilot at least one vehicle, this is creating another one that can pilot another vehicle. So this is really good. It's a really good card. I think this makes vehicles a lot more worth it. This makes it to where you're running a blue-white vehicle deck. That blue spell we talked about earlier would be run in the white vehicle deck in that case. It'll help you cycle. It'll speed up the white deck just like I said it needed to, so that's really good. So maybe this card makes it to where the white-blue vehicle deck stands a good chance against what I think will be the mono-red vehicle deck. So I look forward to seeing it. Alright, and then our last multicolored card is Satsuki the Living Lore. It is a 2-mana, 1 green, 1 white, 1/3, power 1, toughness 3, legendary human druid. If you tap it, you put a lore counter on each saga that you control. The lore counters, just to stop and talk about that for a moment, is what is activating your other sagas. So the way I've been explaining them is when you play it, you get the first effect. The next time after your next draw step, you get the second effect. And on your third draw step, just after, you get the final effect. What's really happening is that each time, when you first play it, it's getting its first lore counter. The first time you're drawing, during your draw step, it's getting its second lore counter. And then the third one comes after your third draw step. This card is just going to help speed up all the sagas you've played. In a white-green deck, that is a perfect deck for this to go into. I think that's what's running most of the saga enchantments anyways. So green is helping you pull for mana. White is helping you scry. The scrying enchantments are really good. And the other white ones are also modifying your cards. So I think you run this in that modification deck we were talking about, but that does make it a multicolored deck at that point. So I can see this being really good. Maybe that makes Samurai combo well with the Spirits of the Green that are buffing up based on the modified cards you have. Maybe this card, just this one card, might make that deck a worthwhile deck to try. So it's allowing you to activate all of your saga effects just by tapping it. So just like the legendary dragon spirits we've seen, they've chosen to give this card a similar ability to where when it dies, you choose one of 2 effects. The first one being that you can return target saga or enchantment creature you control to its owner's hand. The second one being that you can return target saga card from your graveyard to your hand. This card dying is still good for you because it dies, you've got saga creatures on the board, which means that all their other effects have already happened. This card dies, you return the creature that has the better saga effects, or maybe a creature that has an effect when it enters the battlefield. Return it to your hand, and then recast it for its other effects. It'll be slower than if you had the Living Lore on the board, but these saga enchantments are all pretty powerful. So, especially if you're modifying more cards. So this card, I think, soloing this card, I mean, it's a legendary creature, you run a couple copies of it in your deck, and I think that makes these modified decks even better than they were. And I was already here for them. So this makes me more here for them. I want to see these decks. I'm going to be this is the deck I run. I'm all about, I care a lot about these blue control the board type effects, but this is board control to the max. And I think that's one of the best advantages you can have. The problem I've had with white decks is they tend to focus on, or that back in the day they would focus on health advantage until you could just outlast your opponent. Then they got into these spirits where they were flooding the board, and I was less excited about that type of board control. The type I like is where you've got cards that are really big. I mean, not just 1 or 2, but you've got 4 or 5. And I think this deck is for that. I think this fits my strategy really well when I play a green deck. I usually run that mono green, but this makes me want to do a green-white modification deck with spirits and maybe the samurai. So I'm looking forward to that. That moves us over to our artifacts. The first one we're going to talk about is the Mech Titan Core. Is a 2-mana 2/4 vehicle with a crew 2, and that's on its own. However, if you tap 5 mana and you exile this card and 4 other artifact creatures and or vehicles that you control, you create Mech Titan, which is a legendary 10/10 construct artifact creature token who has flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink, and haste, is considered to have all colors, and when that token leaves the battlefield, you return all cards that you had to exile to create that card, except for this one, to the battlefield tapped under the owner's control. This is a really good card in that red, I think in the mono red artifact vehicle deck. And I think you're really just supposed to create this boss monster, and that's how I see it. In Yu-Gi-Oh, this is not Magic, but in Yu-Gi-Oh, this reminds me a lot of the card that you remove all these like different pieces, these mechanical pieces from the board to create one big creature. That's what this is, and I think that's amazing with flying, vigilance, trample, lifelink, and immediately can attack when you've played it for 5 mana, sacrificing essentially for the time being 4 of the vehicles, artifacts that you have, so long as they're all creatures that were on the board. I think that's a really good trade-off for 5 mana. I think this might be too slow, but for 2 mana 2/4 that just requires a crew 2, if you run it right, I think that even this card on its own is okay. So you still run it in the artifact vehicle mono red deck. I don't think that you run this in a samurai vehicle deck though, because your samurais are not artifact creatures, so they wouldn't combo well with this card. If anything, they'd slow down your deck. So I think in the mono red vehicle deck, this is some more support for that, is what I think. But good card. And now caffeine. Alright. Our final artifact card that we'll be talking about today is Walking Skyscraper. It is an 8 mana artifact creature construct that costs 1 last to cast for each modified creature you control. It's an 8/8 with trample and has hexproof so long as this card is untapped. I think my overall opinion of this card is you want it to be probably at least 5 mana for this card to be worthwhile to play, because I think you're playing it, you're getting 1 attack from it, and that may be it. You may not even be dealing damage. I think this is baiting out a card from your opponent, is what I think is happening. Because as soon as this card taps to attack, it is targetable by spells that your opponent controls. Keep in mind, hexproof means that this card cannot be targeted by spells that or abilities that your opponents control. So you can still modify this card yourself. But I don't know if you run this. You might just run this in that green-white modification deck. Maybe. I think this might be worth it. Because if you're really comboing this well with modifying your cards, I mean, theoretically, I see a situation where you've got 4 cards on the board that have all been modified to where there's a 4 mana 8/8 with trample and hexproof until it attacks. That is absolutely a worthwhile card. So I think you run this in that deck. I don't think you run a lot of copies of this card, maybe just 1. It's not a great card. I think that it's baiting out a card from your opponent, but it at least establishes a threat that your opponent needs to have an answer for, or they're taking significant damage on your turn. So I definitely think you run 1, maybe 2 cards. I'm probably going to keep it to 1, as much as I like this card. So I think that it is definitely a good card. I don't think it's a great card you've got to run more than 1 copy of this card in your deck, kind of deal. But it's a good card. And that's our final artifact. So we did have 1 new land that they talked about, which is Otawara Soaring Sky. It is a legendary land, so it does tap for a blue mana, but it also has a channel ability. For 4 mana, you discard this card. You return target artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand, and this ability costs 1 mana less to cast for each legendary creature you control. Again, another land that seems to be comboing with having legendary creatures on the board. Maybe that with a green, red, and blue land, that all 3 are supposed to combo with having legendaries, that at least implies that they are expecting you to run that legendary deck as a green, blue, red deck. I don't know if you run this land. I don't know if you run this land instead of an island, since there are a lot of cards that do specifically combo well with having an island. But I could see this being tried out. I'm gonna say, for me, I wouldn't. It's too specific for me to run this land. I think I might prefer to run other land cards instead. It's a legendary land. You can run with a couple copies of it in your deck, but you can only have 1 on the board at a time. So it taps for a blue mana. It's not useless, but I think even then, the channel ability is just so specific that it's essentially a 4 mana ability where you discard this card, you have 4 mana that you've tapped to get an artifact, creature, enchantment, or planeswalker back to your hand. And I think that ends up being still too slow. So, especially for a blue deck. So I'm going to go ahead and say this is too slow and move on. So the final 3 cards that they've sneak peeked are the enchantment sagas. The first one is the Fall of Lord Konda, which is a 3 mana. First lore counter it gets is when you play it, and it exiles target creature an opponent controls with a mana value of 4 or greater. This is a great way to answer a threat that's on the board, especially if it's early enough in the game to where you only have 3 mana and you're right now needing to answer. It's a good enough ability where even without looking at the other abilities on this card, you probably hold off and wait until you need to play this card as an answer to, or as a response to something your opponent's played. The second lore counter comes after you've drawn on your next turn. Each player gains control of all permanents that they own. This is an anti-red card, so it's good to have a response to your red, to going up against other red decks, but that also does make this card really specific for that second effect. And then finally it transforms into Fragment of Konda. It is a 1/3 human noble enchantment creature with Defender, and when it dies, you draw a card. That's pretty slow for a white. I think this card is it's not modifying any of your cards. I think it's probably too slow to run. It's 3 mana, exile target creature an opponent controls, mana value 4 or greater, and then you happen to get other effects. I think that's the best way to read this card, because that's the best ability this card has, and I think that normally is only worth 2 mana. You're paying 1 extra mana for those other abilities. I think it's probably worth it to do. So, not a bad card. You maybe run this as a response card, but it does count as an enchantment saga, so I think in that sense, if you're comboing it with other cards, this still ends up being good. But of the enchantment sagas we've seen so far, this is definitely on the slower side. So, not one of the favorite ones for you to run. If you do run it, I don't think you run a lot of copies of it. You've got other good options to run, better options to run. So, overall, slow card. Our next one is the Restoration of Iganjo. So the first effect, this is a 3 mana card as well, that searches your library for a basic Plains card, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle your library. It's good to see white cards that allow you to search your library for lands. You don't see a lot of them, so when you can get them, makes them a good card. For 3 mana, that would normally be a slow card, but of course it has other effects. The second one, you may discard a card, and when you do, return target permanent card with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. Combos really well with your Samurai. I think that makes this a little bit better of a card. And our next transformation effect is Architect of Restoration, a 3/4 enchantment creature fox monk, vigilance, and whenever this attacks or blocks, you create a 1/1 colorless spirit creature token. So it gives you something else to modify. This is not bad. Even a 3-mana 3/4 vigilance that has that ability, that would already have been worth it. So, I mean, of course you're not playing it on turn 3. The other effects are probably good enough to still be worth to get first and then get your creature out. So, tough card to evaluate, but I think this card is a good card. I do think you run this. You certainly run this over the other card we just talked about, so I like it. I think you run it. Maybe you run a couple of it. I don't think you run a lot of it, but maybe 2 copies of this card would be worth it. And our final card that they've sneak peeked for us is a red enchantment saga, which is a 3-mana Fable of the Mirror Breaker. The first effect is create a 2/2 red goblin shaman creature token who has the ability that whenever this creature attacks, you create a treasure token. So just keep in mind, treasure tokens can be tapped and sacrificed for 1 mana of any color that you need. The second effect is you may discard up to 2 cards, and if you do, draw that many cards. That's really good for a red deck. Red doesn't have a lot of drawing either. It's one of their weak points is being able to draw cards. So you're normally flooding out the board in a red deck, and then if your opponent answers that and board wipes you, and you've played everything that was in your hand, you are essentially top decking the rest of the game, hoping that what you draw somehow changes the game. And since your goal in a red deck is to flood the board, oftentimes you don't have a way to get back. So your opponent answers your flooded board, you essentially lose the game. So it's good to see another card, a card for red at all, that allows you to draw. So I like that. It's unfortunate that you have to discard 2 cards for that to happen, though. So up to 2 cards. You can discard 1 and draw. So it would be a better effect if you could just draw cards. And then it transforms into Reflection of Jiki. Wow, I butchered that name. That, I don't know. Jiki. It is a enchantment creature goblin shaman 2/2. If you tap 1 mana and you tap that card, it creates a token that is a copy of another target non-legendary creature that you control, except that it would have haste, and you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. You can activate this ability on either player's turn, so this is good if you need something to defend, and it's still good if you need something that needs to attack right away. It being a goblin makes a lot of sense. I also think what's really good is, keep in mind, if you give something haste, that means you can use it immediately. So in a goblin deck, I'm predicting this is a mono red goblin vehicle deck situation where you've created a token of something, just that way you can meet a crew requirement that you would need. So you tap it to help crew a bigger vehicle. That's what I think is happening. Maybe I'm reading the card wrong, but I think that's what this card is meant to be used for. So I think for 3 mana, I think this card is not bad. The first effect is really good, and the transformation effect is really good. I think the second effect is a hit or miss, but for the first and last effect of this card, I think you run this, and you've got to run this in... I could see it being run in just a goblin deck, but I think this is going to be significantly better in the mono-red goblin vehicle deck that I have imagined in my head that may or may not even exist, ever. So, maybe I'm the only one who tries to build that deck. I definitely think I'll try. So, this will be good, and this will be in that deck. So you run a couple copies of this. I think you run 3 copies of this. You can have 4. I think you run 3. So that's my take on all the cards that they've sneak peeked in this set for today. So drop a comment down below. Talk about some of the cards that you've seen on here. Do you disagree with some of the cards we've talked about? Do you absolutely agree, but you're just super excited? You've got to talk about the card. Drop a comment down below. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel, and we'll see you next time.